Tonight, we're pulling back the heavy velvet curtains on one of history's most misunderstood subjects, the medieval bedroom. For centuries, people have imagined the Middle Ages as a time of rigid chastity belts, terrified virgins, and priests lurking in every corner to punish pleasure. But the truth, it's far more complicated, far more human, and in many ways far more interesting than the myths we've been told. So, before we begin this journey through 1,000 years of European intimacy, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Whether you're drifting off to sleep or just beginning your day, we're about to explore what sex was really like when knights rode through forests and stone castles dotted the landscape. The Middle Ages weren't one single era with one single attitude towards sex. We're talking about roughly 1,000 years, from around 500 to 1500, across an entire continent. Attitudes shifted dramatically over those centuries. What was acceptable in the year 800 might have been scandalous by 1400. What happened in rural England might have been completely different from urban Italy. And perhaps most importantly, what the church said people should do and what people actually did were often worlds apart. See, we have this image of medieval people as somehow less sexual than we are, less passionate, more controlled by religion and fear. But medieval people were human beings with the same desires, the same needs, the same capacity for pleasure and intimacy that humans have always had. They fell in love. They lusted, they cheated, they experimented, they sought pleasure. They just did it all within a very different social, legal, and religious framework than we navigate today. The challenge in understanding medieval sexuality is that most of our sources come from a very specific group of people: monks, priests, theologians, church officials, men who had taken vows of chastity and spent their lives thinking about sin. These were the people who could read and write, who created the documents that survived. So, when we look at medieval texts about sex, we're often reading the opinions of the people who were most opposed to it, or at least most concerned with regulating it. But if we read carefully, if we look at court records and medical texts and literature, and the occasional scandalous confession, we can piece together a picture of what medieval sex really looked like. And that picture is messy, contradictory, and deeply human. It's a world where prostitution was legal and regulated, where couples had trial marriages before making it official, where young people lost their virginity long before their wedding nights despite dire warnings from priests. It's a world where the church tried desperately to control when, how, and why people had sex, imposing rules so strict that married couples might only have a handful of days each month when intercourse was permitted. And yet it's also a world where those rules were routinely ignored, where people found workarounds, where desire won out over doctrine more often than not. We'll explore the bedding ceremonies where wedding guests escorted newlyweds to their chambers and sometimes stayed to ensure consummation happened. We'll examine the municipal brothels that cities established to protect respectable women and maintain social order. We'll discover the herbal contraceptives that women passed down through generations, the sexual positions that theologians ranked by sinfulness, and the courtly love tradition that glorified extramarital passion. We'll talk about the medical beliefs that made celibacy seem dangerous and sex seem necessary for health, about the double standards that punished women for adultery while winking at men's infidelity, about same-sex relations that happened in the shadows, sometimes punished brutally, sometimes ignored, about the gap between the virgin saints the church held up as ideals and the reality of human sexuality that persisted regardless of religious teaching. This isn't going to be a simple story. Medieval attitudes towards sex were complex, often contradictory. The same society that built convents for former prostitutes also ran municipal brothels. The same theologians who condemned all sexual pleasure also acknowledged that wives needed regular intercourse for their health. The same courts that punished adultery also tacitly accepted that nobles would have lovers outside their marriages. So, settle in, get comfortable. Whether you're here to learn or to drift off to the sound of history, we're about to spend the next couple of hours exploring one of the most intimate aspects of medieval life, because understanding how our ancestors approached sex helps us understand how they thought about bodies, pleasure, sin, marriage, gender, and what it meant to be human. The story of medieval sex is ultimately a story about the eternal tension between desire and control, between what authorities decree and what people actually do, between the ideal and the real. It's a story that echoes through the centuries, reminding us that human sexuality has always been complicated, always been subject to regulation, and always found ways to persist despite the restrictions placed upon it. The Church's vision, how sex was supposed to be. Let's start with what the medieval Church taught about sex, because those teachings formed the official framework, the rules everyone was supposed to follow, even if they didn't. The Christian Church in medieval Europe had inherited a complicated relationship with sexuality from its early days. On one hand, the Bible commanded humans to be fruitful and multiply. Children were necessary. Families needed heirs. The faith needed new generations of believers. On the other hand, early Christian thinkers were deeply influenced by ideas that associated the body with corruption and the spirit with purity. St. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, shaped medieval thinking about sex more than perhaps any other figure. Augustine believed that before the fall, before Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, sex would have been a calm, rational act of procreation, totally under conscious control. But after the fall, sexual desire became tainted by lust. The very fact that sexual arousal happens involuntarily, that you can't simply will an erection or control desire through pure reason, was proof to Augustine that sex had become corrupted. So, Augustine argued that while sex was necessary for procreation, it was always tinged with sin because it involved lust. Even within marriage, even for the purpose of having children, sexual pleasure was suspect. The best state, the holiest state, was virginity, celibacy, complete abstinence from all sexual activity. This created a hierarchy in medieval religious thought. At the very top were virgins, both male and female, who had never engaged in sexual activity. Monks, nuns, priests, dedicated laypeople who preserved their virginity throughout their lives. These people were considered closest to God, most pure, most holy. Next came married people who engaged in sex solely for procreation, with no pleasure, following all the Church's rules. Below them were married people who enjoyed sex, or did it for pleasure rather than just to make babies. And at the bottom were fornicators, adulterers, and those who engaged in what the Church called unnatural acts. But here's the thing, the Church also recognized that most people couldn't maintain celibacy. As St. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians, "It is better to marry than to burn with passion." Marriage, then, was a concession to human weakness. It was the Church's way of containing and regulating sexuality, channeling it into an acceptable form. Once you were married, sex was permitted, but with extensive restrictions. The Church, through its theologians and in handbooks for priests who heard confessions, laid out detailed rules about when, how, why, and in what manner married couples could have intercourse. First, the when. You could not have sex on Sundays, the Lord's Day. You could not have sex on Wednesdays or Fridays, which were days of fasting. You could not have sex on Saturday, because that was the eve of the Lord's Day. You could not have sex during Lent, the 40 days before Easter, or during Advent, the weeks before Christmas, or during the Easter season, or during Pentecost. You could not have sex on any holy feast day, and there were many throughout the year. You could not have sex during a woman's menstruation, or during pregnancy, or while she was breastfeeding, or for 40 days after childbirth. If you add all this up, as some historians have done, married couples following all these rules would be left with perhaps 2 to 5 days per month when sex was actually permitted, 2 to 5 days out of 30. Think about that. Then there was the why. Sex was permitted for one reason and one reason only: procreation, the creation of children. Any other purpose was sinful. If you had sex for pleasure, even with your own spouse, that was a sin. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential medieval theologians, warned that a man who was too passionate with his wife was treating her like a prostitute. The pleasure that might accompany intercourse was acceptable only as a side effect, not as a goal. You were supposed to approach the marital bed with the same dutiful mindset you might bring to any other necessary but not particularly enjoyable task. Some theologians went further, suggesting that even the desire for your spouse was problematic. One 9th century text explained that having sex with your wife while desiring her was a minor sin. The ideal was apparently to engage in intercourse with complete emotional and physical detachment, purely as a procreative duty. Now, the how. Sexual positions were carefully ranked according to how natural they were. The only fully acceptable position was what we now call missionary, man on top, woman on her back. This position was considered natural because it maintained the proper hierarchy, with the man in the dominant active role and the woman in the passive submissive role. It also, theologians believed, was the position most likely to result in conception, which was after all the whole point. Other positions were ranked in order of sinfulness. Albertus Magnus, a 13th century theologian, created a hierarchy. Missionary was first and fully acceptable. Side by side was questionable, but not mortally sinful. Seated was more problematic. Standing was worse. And rear entry, what they called a tergo, was the worst of all because it was considered beastly, the way animals coupled, and thus confused the boundaries between human and animal. Having the woman on top was particularly condemned because it reversed the natural order. It put the woman in the active, dominant position, which threatened the whole medieval understanding of gender roles. Some texts even suggested that children conceived with the woman on top might be born with defects, as punishment for the parent's unnatural act. As for oral, anal sex, or any other sexual activity that couldn't result in procreation, these were absolutely forbidden. They fell under the category of sodomy, which was not just a sin, but a crime. These acts were considered crimes against nature itself, perversions of the natural order. The punishments could be severe: burning at the stake, hanging, imprisonment. The same category included same-sex relations, which we'll discuss more later. Interestingly, the Church's teachings on sexuality evolved over the centuries. In the earlier medieval period, say before the year 1000, there was actually more tolerance for different sexual behaviours. Married priests were common. The rules about when you could have sex weren't as strictly defined. Penances for sexual sins were often lighter. But as the Church became more organised and powerful, especially after the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century, it tried to assert more control over sexuality. Priests were required to be celibate. Marriage became a sacrament, a holy rite. The rules about sex became more detailed and more restrictive. By the 13th and 14th centuries, you had extensive theological treatises about every possible sexual situation, lawyers arguing about what constituted marital consent, and confessors' manuals that listed every conceivable sexual sin and the appropriate penance. Yet, even as these rules became more elaborate and more restrictive, the gap between doctrine and practice was growing. Because while the Church could tell people what to do, it couldn't actually watch them in their bedrooms. And as we'll see, medieval people found all sorts of ways to navigate, bend, or simply ignore the rules they found too restrictive. The medical community, interestingly, often pushed back against the Church's most extreme teachings. Physicians inherited knowledge from ancient Greek and Roman medical texts, especially the work of Galen, and they believed that sexual activity was actually necessary for health. Too much celibacy, they argued, could make you sick. We'll explore these medical beliefs later, but it's worth noting that even in the Middle Ages, there was tension between religious doctrine and medical understanding. For now, though, understand that this was the official position, the ideal the Church held up. Sex within marriage, only for procreation, only in the missionary position, only on permitted days, without pleasure or passion. Virginity was better. Celibacy was holiest, and any deviation was sinful. Of course, the reality was far different. Marriage, bedding, and consummation. Marriage in medieval Europe was both a religious sacrament and a social contract, and sex played a complex role in making it official. To understand medieval sexuality, we need to understand how marriage worked, because marriage was the only context in which sex was officially permitted. For much of the Middle Ages, marriage was surprisingly informal. Two people could marry simply by exchanging vows in the present tense, saying, "I marry you" to each other. No priest required, no witnesses necessary, no church ceremony, just consent between two people and they were married in the eyes of the church. This led to all sorts of complications, as you might imagine. People disputed whether they were actually married. Men and women disagreed about what exactly had been said. There was a major difference between a promise to marry in the future and an actual marriage vow, but people often confused them or deliberately misrepresented what had occurred. Here's where it gets interesting. If a couple made a future promise to marry, a betrothal, and then had sex, they were automatically considered married in the eyes of the church. The sexual act itself completed the marriage. Many couples didn't know this, leading to situations where people thought they were just engaged and having premarital sex, when legally they had actually gotten married without realizing it. The church eventually tried to formalize things. By the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the church required that marriages be publicly announced beforehand, that banns be read in church on 3 successive Sundays or feast days before the wedding. This gave anyone who knew of an impediment to the marriage, like the couple being too closely related, or one of them already being married to someone else, a chance to object. But even with these reforms, consent remained the key element. Both parties had to freely consent to the marriage. This was actually quite progressive for the time. Forced marriages were technically invalid, though of course many marriages, especially among the nobility, involved intense family pressure. The church set minimum ages for marriage, 12 for girls, 14 for boys. These were based on ideas about when people reached puberty and could physically consummate a marriage. In practice, noble families often betrothed children much younger, but the marriages weren't supposed to be consummated until the parties reached these ages. Among peasants and common people, marriages typically happened later, in the late teens or early 20s. People needed to establish themselves economically before they could support a family. But among the nobility, where marriage was about alliances and property, matches were often arranged while the couple were still children. Now, let's talk about the wedding night, because this is where things get really interesting. After the wedding ceremony, which by the later Middle Ages usually involved a church blessing, even if that wasn't strictly required, there was the bedding ceremony. This was a public ritual that involved the community in the couple's transition to married life, and, critically, in the consummation of their marriage. The bedding ceremony varied by region and social class, but generally it went something like this. After the wedding feast, the guests would escort the newlyweds to their bedchamber. This was a boisterous, often bawdy procession. People sang songs, made jokes, offered advice, teased the couple. It was a way of marking the transition from single to married life, but it was also about ensuring that the marriage would be properly consummated. Once in the bedchamber, a priest would bless the marriage bed. He would sprinkle it with holy water, say prayers asking God to bless the couple with children and protect them from evil spirits. The prayers often invoked biblical couples and asked for the same fruitfulness and favour. Then the couple would drink spiced wine together, often called a benediction posset. This was usually a mixture of wine with honey, spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, sometimes eggs or cream. It was supposed to encourage fertility and give the groom stamina. The wedding guests, particularly the bridesmaids and groomsmen, would help the couple prepare for bed. They would undress them, or at least help them into their nightclothes. In some traditions, they would sit on the edges of the bed and throw stockings at the couple. If you hit the bride or groom with a stocking, it was believed you would be the next to marry. This may be the origin of the modern garter toss tradition. Here's the crucial part. In most of Western Europe, the actual act of consummation was private. The guests would eventually leave, drawing the bed curtains and letting the couple have privacy. But in some cases, especially among royalty where the legitimacy of future heirs was paramount, witnesses would stay to verify that consummation occurred. They might watch from an observation deck, or listen from outside the curtains, or check the bedsheets afterward for blood that would indicate the bride's virginity had been intact. This last practice, the checking of bedsheets, was based on the mistaken belief that all women bleed when they first have penetrative sex. In reality, many women don't. But this myth persisted. The bloodied sheets might be displayed publicly the next morning to prove the marriage had been consummated and that the bride had indeed been a virgin. For the couple, especially the bride, this was often terrifying. Imagine being young, possibly having never met your spouse before the wedding day, expected to perform sexually with a crowd of people just outside the door and your virtue literally on display afterward. Many brides were only 12 or 13 years old, married to much older men. Some couples refused to participate in bedding ceremonies. King Charles I of England famously barred the door to his bedroom on his wedding night, refusing to let the guests in. But the custom persisted for centuries among all social classes. The bedding ceremony served multiple functions. It was entertainment, certainly. Medieval people loved a good party, and weddings were major social events. But it was also about community involvement in the marriage. By participating in the bedding, the community was acknowledging the marriage, supporting it, and in a sense taking responsibility for it. More practically, the bedding ceremony and the emphasis on immediate consummation had legal implications. Consummation was what made a marriage complete and indissoluble. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled. People could claim they had never actually had sex, and thus were not truly married. By having witnesses to the bedding, by publicly acknowledging that consummation had occurred, there was less room for one party to later claim the marriage was invalid. This also meant that if one partner was incapable of sexual intercourse, the marriage could be annulled. Impotence was grounds for ending a marriage, which led to some interesting situations. If a man claimed impotence to get out of a marriage, the ecclesiastical court might have experts test his claim. These experts were often prostitutes who would attempt to arouse the man to prove whether he was truly incapable, or just using it as an excuse. The church also recognized something called a Josephite marriage, or white marriage, where a couple was married but both took vows of perpetual chastity. They would live together as spouses but never consummate the marriage. This was considered a holy arrangement, imitating Mary and Joseph. Several saints were said to have had such marriages, but it required the consent of both parties and was relatively rare. Far more common were couples who got married in the traditional way but then interpreted the rules rather flexibly. Despite the church's teaching that betrothal was not the same as marriage, many engaged couples treated their betrothal as permission to have sex. They viewed it as a trial period. If the relationship worked out, if they were sexually compatible, if no pregnancy resulted, or if one did and they were happy about it, they would proceed with the formal wedding. If not, they might try to break the betrothal. St. Vincent Ferrer, a 15th century preacher, complained that by age 15, most young men had lost their virginity. When they came to confession, many were surprised to learn that fornication was actually a sin. They genuinely didn't know or hadn't thought about it. This reveals something important. There was a huge gap between what the church taught and what people actually believed and practiced. In many communities, premarital sex between betrothed couples was considered normal, acceptable, not really sinful. As long as marriage followed, especially if pregnancy resulted, people weren't too concerned about it. The phrase si non caste, tamen caute became common in medieval Europe. It translates roughly as if not chastely, at least cautiously, or if you can't be good, be careful. It's essentially a medieval version of a modern saying about discretion in sexual matters. The fact that this phrase was widespread suggests that people understood sexual desire was powerful, and that not everyone would or could follow the church's strict rules. Better to be discreet than to cause scandal. So, marriage in medieval Europe was this complicated institution. Officially, it required consent, should wait until puberty, needed to be publicly announced, and was only truly complete when consummated. The church tried to control all aspects of it, but in practice people negotiated their own paths, balancing social expectations, personal desires, economic realities, and religious teachings. And once married, despite all the church's rules about when and how to have sex, couples did what couples have always done. They figured it out in private, away from the prying eyes of priests and theologians. The gap between rules and reality. Let's talk about what people actually did, because the gap between the church's teachings and lived reality was vast. Picture a medieval village. The priest stands in the church on Sunday, reminding everyone that sex outside marriage is a mortal sin, that even married couples should abstain except for procreation on permitted days. Everyone nods solemnly. Then they go home, and behind closed doors, they do what humans have always done. The evidence for this disconnect comes from multiple sources. court records show constant prosecutions for fornication, adultery, and other sexual offences. If these rules were being followed, there wouldn't be so many cases. Medical texts acknowledge that people have sex for pleasure, not just procreation. Literature, especially the fabliaux, comic tales that were hugely popular in medieval France, depicts a world of sexual escapades, adultery, and clever tricks. One of the most revealing sources is penitential books, guides for priests hearing confession. These books list every imaginable sexual sin and assign appropriate penances. The very existence of such detailed guides tells us these sins were happening regularly enough that priests needed instructions on how to handle them. The lists are extensive: intercourse in forbidden positions, sex on forbidden days, sex with animals, use of sex toys, contraception, adultery, fornication between unmarried people, sex between people of different social classes, clergy breaking their vow of celibacy, same-sex relations, incest, and on and on. For each sin, the penitential books specify the appropriate penance, usually a certain number of days of fasting on bread and water. Adultery could require years of penance. But the fact that penances are specified means these acts were occurring with enough frequency to require standardized responses. Let's start with premarital sex, because this was probably the most common deviation from church teaching. As mentioned earlier, many young people, especially those who were betrothed, had sex before their formal wedding. In some regions, this was so common as to be essentially accepted. A couple would get engaged, their families would agree to the match, and then the couple would begin sleeping together. If the woman got pregnant, the wedding would be moved up. If they proved incompatible, they might try to break the betrothal, though this was complicated if they'd already had sex, since that technically made them married. The church tried to combat this through the reading of bans and by emphasizing that betrothal was not marriage. But in practice, many communities saw nothing wrong with engaged couples having sex as long as marriage followed. Fornication between unmarried people who weren't betrothed was more seriously condemned, but it still happened constantly. Young people working as servants, apprentices, or labourers in towns often had limited prospects for marriage. They might not be able to afford to marry for years, if ever. But they were young and had sexual desires. So they had relationships, some fleeting, some long-term. Manorial courts regularly fined women for premarital sex through a fine called ledger-white. The frequency of these fines tells us how common the behaviour was. Women were fined more often than men, reflecting the double standard that women's sexual behaviour was more carefully monitored and more harshly judged. Interestingly, while the church condemned all sex outside marriage equally, secular authorities and communities often distinguished between different types. A relationship between two unmarried people was bad but forgivable. An affair between a married person and an unmarried one was worse. Adultery between two married people was worst of all, at least in theory. In practice, though, there was a massive gender double standard. A married woman's adultery was treated as a serious crime. It could result in severe punishment, public humiliation, being paraded through the streets in your undergarments, having your head shaved, being fined, even having your nose or ears cut off in earlier periods. This reflected concerns about paternity and inheritance. If a married woman had sex outside marriage, any resulting child might not be her husband's legitimate heir. A married man's adultery, by contrast, was often winked at. Oh, he had a mistress? Well, men have needs. Oh, he visited prostitutes. Better that than bothering respectable women. The church officially condemned male adultery just as much as female adultery, but secular authorities and communities were far more lenient. Among the nobility, this double standard was even more pronounced. Nearly every medieval king had mistresses, often openly acknowledged. Some had children with these women, whom they would support and even title, though they couldn't inherit the throne. The king's wife was expected to tolerate this as long as she remained faithful herself. This extended to nobles more generally. A lord might have multiple sexual relationships outside his marriage, and as long as he was reasonably discreet and didn't create too much scandal, it was tacitly accepted. His wife, however, was expected to be absolutely faithful. Her adultery could result in her being locked away in a convent or worse. The literature of courtly love, which we'll discuss more later, openly celebrated passionate love between knights and noble ladies, often married ladies. These were supposed to be chaste relationships, more about longing and service than physical consummation, at least in theory. But the popularity of these stories suggests that the line between the romantic ideal and physical reality was often blurred. Medieval people also had access to contraception, despite the Church's condemnation of it. The most common method was coitus interruptus, withdrawal before ejaculation. This is explicitly mentioned in the Bible in the story of Onan, who spilled his seed on the ground to avoid impregnating his deceased brother's wife. The Church condemned this as a sin, but it was widespread because it was free, required no special knowledge, and left no evidence. Women had access to various herbal remedies believed to prevent pregnancy or induce termination. Recipe books and medical texts mention dozens of plants: pennyroyal, rue, Queen Anne's lace, parsley, artemisia, savin, and many others. Some of these actually do have contraceptive or abortifacient properties. Others were useless or even dangerous. Women would drink infusions of these herbs or insert them vaginally as pessaries. They would mix them with honey, olive oil, or other substances and apply them to the cervix to block sperm. Vinegar was sometimes used as a spermicide. Some women inserted plugs of cloth, wool, or sea sponge soaked in various substances. There were also magical methods, which tell us more about what people hoped for than what actually worked. Amulets made from various animal parts, herbs or other materials, rituals involving specific actions or words. These were part of folk magic that existed alongside Christianity, more prevalent in rural areas and among women. The Church condemned all contraception as sinful, essentially equivalent to murder because it prevented life. But clearly people used these methods anyway, driven by poverty, fear of too many children, health concerns, or the desire to have sex without consequences. Child termination, too, occurred despite being condemned. Some of the same herbal remedies used for contraception could induce miscarriage if taken in stronger doses. Medieval medical texts, especially those from the Islamic world that were translated into Latin, discussed child termination in certain circumstances, particularly when the mother's life was at risk. The Church's position was complicated. Early in pregnancy, before quickening when the mother could feel movement, some theologians distinguished between the act of causing a miscarriage and actual murder. The punishment was severe, but not quite as severe as for killing a born person. After quickening, it was considered more serious. But these theological distinctions didn't always translate into how people thought about it practically. Women facing unwanted pregnancies, especially unmarried women who would face severe social consequences, sometimes resorted to child termination. Midwives and wise women might assist, though they risked punishment if discovered. Some women tried to hide their pregnancies and dispose of the baby after birth, though infanticide was considered murder and severely punished. All of this reveals a society in which sexual desire and activity were much more prominent than the Church's ideal would suggest. Yes, there were people who took the teachings seriously, who genuinely tried to be chaste or to restrict marital sex to the approved times and purposes. Some succeeded. Many religious people, monks and nuns, maintained celibacy throughout their lives, though we also have plenty of evidence that many did not. But, for the average person, sex was a part of life that happened according to its own logic, shaped more by desire, opportunity, social circumstances, and practical concerns than by theological doctrine. The Church tried to regulate it, punish transgressions, and maintain the ideal. But it was fighting human nature, and human nature is persistent. Medieval literature gives us glimpses of this reality. The fabliaux, those comic tales from France, are full of sexual adventures, stories of wives cuckolding their husbands, priests seducing women who come to confession, clever schemes to arrange secret rendezvous. These stories were popular entertainment, and while they're exaggerated for comic effect, they reflect a society where sex outside the Church's approved boundaries was common enough to be relatable and funny. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, includes a wife who's had 5 husbands and isn't shy about discussing sex. It includes a merchant's young wife who has an affair with a monk. It includes a miller's daughter who sleeps with a young clerk. These characters and situations rang true to medieval audiences because they reflected lived reality. So, when we think about medieval sex, we need to hold 2 truths simultaneously. The Church taught a very restrictive set of rules, and people routinely broke those rules. This wasn't unique to the Middle Ages. It's the same dynamic you see in any society where there's a gap between official morality and human behaviour. What makes the medieval period interesting is how explicit the Church was in trying to control sexuality, and how much evidence we have of people navigating around those controls. The regulated sex trade. Now let's talk about prostitution, because this is where the gap between church teaching and social reality becomes most striking. The Church condemned prostitution as sinful. At the same time, cities across medieval Europe established, regulated, and profited from municipal brothels. The theological justification came from St. Augustine, who argued that prostitution was a necessary evil. Better for men to visit prostitutes than to seduce respectable women. Better to have this sin contained and managed than to have it spread uncontrolled through society. Thomas Aquinas used a memorable metaphor. Prostitution in a city is like a sewer in a palace. It's unpleasant but necessary. Take it away, and the whole place becomes foul. The idea was that men had sexual needs that couldn't always be met through marriage, either because they weren't married yet, or because their wives were unavailable due to pregnancy, menstruation, or any of the other many times sex was forbidden. So, cities established official brothels, appointed brothel keepers, set up red light districts, and created detailed regulations. This happened across Europe, in France, Germany, Italy, England, Spain. The specifics varied, but the general pattern was similar. Take Southwark in London, across the river from the city proper. This area was under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester, who licensed and taxed the brothels there. The prostitutes working in Southwark were known as Winchester geese, a reference to the bishop's profitable involvement in the sex trade. Yes, you read that right. A bishop ran brothels. In 1161, these Southwark brothels received a set of regulations that tell us a lot about how prostitution worked in medieval England. The rules specified that no woman with a contagious disease could work in the brothels. No married women were allowed to be prostitutes, presumably to avoid adultery charges. Women couldn't be held against their will or trapped by debt to the brothel keeper. Brothel keepers were prohibited from holding men prisoner for debt. If a man couldn't pay, he couldn't be locked up until he found the money. They also couldn't drag men in off the street. The women could solicit, but not forcibly pull potential customers into the establishment. Interestingly, the women weren't allowed to stay in the brothels on holy days. They had to leave and give their souls a rest, at least temporarily. During times when Parliament was in session, prostitutes couldn't work at night, presumably to prevent members of Parliament from being distracted from their duties. On the continent, regulations were often more detailed. In some German cities, brothel keepers were sworn officials taking an oath of office to the city council. They were expected to run their establishments according to strict rules. Prostitutes might be limited in the number of customers they could see in a day. They were required to wear distinctive clothing so everyone would know their profession. In Florence, prostitutes had to wear gloves and bells on their hats. In Milan, they wore black cloaks. In other cities, they wore a yellow band or a red cap or some other marker. This served several purposes. It warned respectable women to avoid these areas. It prevented prostitutes from being mistaken for respectable women, and it allowed authorities to monitor the trade. Some cities established municipal brothels run by the city itself. The city would own the building, appoint the brothel keeper, collect rent and taxes, and use the revenue for public purposes. In some places, this was a significant source of income for the city government. These municipal brothels usually had rules designed to protect both the workers and the customers, at least in theory. Brothel keepers couldn't beat the women excessively. They had to provide decent food and accommodation. The women couldn't be forced to have sex with someone they genuinely feared or who had mistreated them previously. But reality often fell short of these regulations. A case from Nördlingen, a town in southern Germany, illustrates the dark side. In 1471, the city council investigated the town's public brothel and discovered horrific abuses. The brothel keeper and his partner had been forcing women into prostitution, including at least one who had been working as a kitchen maid and had no intention of becoming a prostitute. When one of these women became pregnant, the brothel keeper's partner forced her to drink an abortifacient that caused her to miscarry a 20-week-old fetus. The woman was made to return to work within days. Other women in the brothel lived in conditions of virtual slavery, trapped by debt and unable to leave. When the investigation revealed these abuses, the council responded by creating even stricter regulations, including a clause requiring women to report any mistreatment immediately. But this case reveals that even with regulation, even with official oversight, prostitution could be exploitative and dangerous. The women who worked as prostitutes came from various backgrounds, but poverty was the common thread. Women with limited economic options might turn to sex work as a way to survive. Servants who lost their positions, women whose husbands had died or abandoned them, young women without family support. Some were forced into it. Others chose it as the best of limited options. High-class prostitutes, sometimes called courtesans, could accumulate wealth and even influence. They might have regular clients among the nobility, live in comfortable circumstances, and eventually retire with enough money to live on. But these women were the exception. Most prostitutes worked in far more difficult circumstances. In some cities, reform movements tried to save prostitutes by establishing convents for former sex workers. Women who wanted to leave prostitution could enter these convents, known as Magdalene houses after Mary Magdalene, and live a religious life. Some of these institutions succeeded in helping women transition to other lives. Others were accused of being not much different from the brothels, with rumours of sexual activity even within the supposed houses of reform. The Church's relationship with prostitution was deeply hypocritical. Officially, it condemned the trade and the women who worked in it. Prostitutes were barred from Christian burial if they died without repenting. They were used as negative examples in sermons, yet church officials like the Bishop of Winchester profited from prostitution. Monasteries and churches sometimes owned property that was rented to brothels. Some theologians argued that prostitutes could be saved. The example of Mary Magdalene, who was believed to have been a prostitute before following Jesus, gave hope that redemption was possible. But in practice, prostitutes were marginalized, stigmatized, and often treated as necessary evils rather than as human beings deserving of dignity. What's fascinating is how openly all this was discussed and managed. These weren't hidden, illegal operations. They were licensed, regulated businesses with official rules. Cities debated the proper location for brothels, often placing them near city walls or in specific districts. They discussed how to balance the moral concerns with the perceived practical necessity. By the mid-16th century, attitudes began to shift. The Protestant Reformation brought a new sexual morality that was even stricter than medieval Catholicism in some ways. Cities began closing their municipal brothels. Augsburg closed its brothel in 1532, Basel in 1534, Frankfurt in 1560. The era of openly tolerated and regulated prostitution was ending, replaced by criminalization. But during the medieval period, prostitution was acknowledged as part of urban life. The sex trade existed in the gap between the ideal of chastity and the reality of human desire. It was managed, taxed, regulated, and tolerated, even as it was condemned. This contradiction tells us something important about medieval society. It could be simultaneously very religious and very practical, holding up high moral standards while making pragmatic accommodations to human behavior. Preventing pregnancy in a Catholic world. Let's delve deeper into contraception and fertility control, because this is an area where medieval people showed remarkable ingenuity despite the Church's strict prohibitions. The Church's position was clear. Any attempt to prevent conception was sinful, essentially the same as murder, because it prevented a potential life. This meant all forms of contraception were condemned, using herbs, using barriers, withdrawal, even sexual positions that were thought to prevent conception, all forbidden. The reasoning was that sex was only justified by its procreative purpose. If you were deliberately trying to have sex without conceiving, you were perverting the natural order and God's plan. Some medieval texts equated contraception with homicide, arguing that preventing a pregnancy was killing a person who would have existed. But despite this clear prohibition, people used contraception. We know this from multiple sources: medical texts that describe contraceptive methods, confessors' manuals that assign penances for using contraception, court cases involving accusations of contraceptive use, and literary references to attempts at fertility control. The most common method, as mentioned earlier, was coitus interruptus. This required no special knowledge, no materials, no preparation, just the man withdrawing before ejaculation. The Bible explicitly condemned this in the story of Onan, and medieval confessors routinely asked about it, but it remained widespread because it was undetectable and required only the cooperation of the male partner. Islamic medical knowledge, which influenced medieval European medicine, recognized and discussed coitus interruptus as a contraceptive method. Some Islamic legal scholars even permitted it under certain circumstances, with the wife's consent. These ideas filtered into European medical thinking, creating tension with Christian teaching. For women, herbal contraceptives were the primary option. Medieval medical texts and herbals describe dozens of plants believed to prevent pregnancy or induce child termination. Some of these worked, others were useless. A few were dangerous. Queen Anne's lace, also called wild carrot, has been used as a contraceptive since ancient times. Recent scientific studies have confirmed it has anti-fertility properties. The seeds taken in certain doses can prevent implantation of a fertilized egg. Medieval women knew this and passed the knowledge down through generations. Pennyroyal, a type of mint, was widely used to bring on the menses, which was code for inducing child termination or preventing implantation. It actually can cause child termination, but it's also toxic and has killed women who took too much. Rue, another herb frequently mentioned, has some contraceptive effects but is also quite poisonous. Silphium, a plant from North Africa, was so prized in the ancient world as a contraceptive that it was harvested to extinction. By the medieval period, it was gone. But related plants like Asafoetida were used as substitutes. Medieval women would prepare these herbs in various ways: drinking infusions or tinctures, inserting them vaginally as suppositories, mixing them with honey, oil, or vinegar to make pessaries that would be placed against the cervix to block or kill sperm. Other substances were used as spermicides or barriers. Vinegar has mild spermicidal properties and was sometimes used as a douche or in soaked sponges. Honey's thick consistency could slow sperm. Olive oil, cedar oil, and various other substances were applied internally. Some methods combined physical barriers with chemical agents. A cloth soaked in vinegar and honey, inserted vaginally. A plug of wool or sea sponge soaked in herbal concoctions. These were attempting to block sperm mechanically while also creating an environment hostile to conception. The cervical cap existed in various forms. Half a lemon with the pulp removed could serve as a barrier covering the cervix. The acid from the lemon also acted as a spermicide. Casanova, centuries later, would use this method with his lovers. We also have evidence of what we might call rhythm method. People understood that women were more fertile at certain times than others, even if they didn't have accurate knowledge of ovulation. Some medical texts suggested that women were most fertile immediately after menstruation, which is actually incorrect, but the attempt to time intercourse to avoid conception was there. What's interesting is how the knowledge was shared. Medical texts written in Latin by educated men describe contraceptive methods, though often framing them as ways to understand what to avoid if you wanted to conceive. But women also had their own knowledge networks. Midwives, wise women, older female relatives would pass down information about herbs and methods. This was sometimes dangerous knowledge to have. During later periods, women with knowledge of herbs and healing could be accused of witchcraft. The association between herbal knowledge and magic was strong. A woman who knew how to prevent pregnancy might also be suspected of being able to curse a pregnancy or cause impotence in men. When contraception failed and pregnancy occurred, child termination was an option, though a dangerous and condemned one. The same herbs used for contraception in milder doses could be taken in stronger amounts to induce miscarriage. Pennyroyal, rue, sevin and others were all used this way. Medieval medical texts from the Byzantine Empire and Islamic world described surgical child termination procedures, including late-term child terminations when the mother's life was at risk. One Byzantine text describes an embryotomy, cutting the fetus into pieces to extract it when normal delivery was impossible. This was presented as a way to save the mother's life, which made it more acceptable even to religious authorities. The Church's position on child termination was complex. Early canon law distinguished between child termination before and after ensoulment, when the fetus received a soul. For male fetuses, this was believed to occur 40 days after conception. For female fetuses, 80 days. Before ensoulment, causing a miscarriage was serious sin, but not murder. After ensoulment, it was homicide. By the later Middle Ages, this distinction was breaking down, and all child terminations were increasingly treated as murder. But in practice, especially early in pregnancy, child termination was probably more common than records suggest. An unmarried woman who miscarried early in pregnancy might not face too many questions. A married woman taking herbs to regulate her menses could claim she didn't know she was pregnant. The medical justification for terminating the child to save the mother's life created some ethical space. If a pregnancy was clearly going to kill the mother, if labour was obstructed and both mother and child would die without intervention, then causing the death of the unborn child to save the mother was sometimes accepted as the lesser evil. All of this reveals a medieval world more familiar with contraception and child termination than we often imagine. Yes, these practices were condemned by the Church. Yes, they were sinful. But people used them anyway, driven by practical necessity. A poor family that couldn't feed another child, a widow who couldn't afford pregnancy, an unmarried woman facing social ruin, a married couple who had already borne all the children they could support. The knowledge persisted because women needed it. The methods were imperfect, often ineffective, sometimes dangerous. But they were attempts to exert some control over fertility in a world where pregnancy was both common and risky. Medieval medicine also recognized male contraceptive methods beyond withdrawal. Some texts mention techniques of controlling ejaculation, learned practices that would prevent semen from being released. Other texts describe substances men could consume to temporarily reduce fertility. Most of these probably didn't work, but the attempt was there. What we see is a society officially committed to the idea that all sex should be open to procreation, while actually engaging in widespread efforts to separate sex from reproduction. This contradiction was managed through a combination of secrecy, discretion, and the understanding that some sins were inevitable in a fallen world. The phrase si non caste tamen caute applies here too. If you can't be chaste, at least be careful. Use contraception discreetly. Don't get caught. Don't cause scandal. The Church might condemn these practices in theory, but in practice, as long as you were relatively discreet and confessed your sins, you could navigate these boundaries. This tells us that medieval people understood their own fertility better than we sometimes credit them with understanding. They knew that certain times were more fertile than others, that certain substances and methods could prevent pregnancy, that there were ways to end an unwanted pregnancy. This knowledge was passed down, shared secretly, used when necessary, despite the official prohibitions against it. Positions, perversions, and the hierarchy of sin. We've touched on sexual positions earlier, but let's explore this in more detail, because the medieval obsession with ranking the sinfulness of different sexual acts reveals a lot about how they thought about the body, gender, and the natural order. Remember, the Church taught that only one position was fully acceptable: man on top, woman on her back, face to face. This was considered the natural position because it maintained proper gender hierarchy and was thought most likely to result in conception. All other positions were ranked in order of increasing sinfulness. Albertus Magnus, the 13th century theologian and philosopher, created an explicit hierarchy: missionary first, side by side second, seated third, standing fourth, and rear entry fifth. The reasoning behind this ranking had to do with several factors. First, how well the position maintained the man's dominant role and the woman's passive role. Any position that gave the woman more active participation or put her in a position of physical dominance was more problematic. Second, whether the position was thought to help or hinder conception. Gravity mattered to medieval thinkers. Missionary position, with the woman on her back, was thought to help the semen stay in the womb. Positions where the woman was upright might cause the semen to leak out. Third, whether the position was beastly, meaning similar to how animals mate. Rear entry was considered particularly problematic because it was how dogs and other animals coupled. Using this position confused the line between human and animal, debasing human sexuality to the level of beasts. The woman on top position, often called the reverse position, was condemned not just as sinful but as potentially dangerous. Some medieval medical texts claim that children conceived with the woman on top might be born deformed or mentally deficient. This was seen as punishment for the parent's unnatural act. The fear of the woman on top position reveals medieval anxieties about gender roles. Women were supposed to be submissive, passive, receptive. Men were supposed to be active, dominant, penetrating. The sexual positions were supposed to reflect and reinforce these gender hierarchies. A woman on top was literally and symbolically in a position of power over the man, and this violated the proper order. Some medieval artwork depicts couples in various sexual positions, including woman on top. This artwork was sometimes meant to be titillating, sometimes educational, sometimes a warning about sin. The fact that it exists suggests these positions were being used despite the prohibitions. Oral was absolutely forbidden. It couldn't result in procreation, so it had no legitimate purpose. It was classified as sodomy, a crime against nature. Anal sex, whether between a man and woman or between two men, was similarly classified as sodomy and severely punished. The category of sodomy was broad and confusing in medieval law. It generally meant any sexual act that perverted the natural order or couldn't lead to procreation. This included oral, anal sex, sex with animals, and male homosexuality. All of these could potentially carry severe penalties, including death. In practice, prosecution and punishment varied widely. In some times and places, sodomy prosecutions were common. In others, they were rare. Much depended on local attitudes, whether the act created scandal, and the status of the people involved. A noble caught in sodomy might face less severe consequences than a commoner. The office of the knight in Florence, established in the 15th century specifically to prosecute sodomy, uncovered thousands of cases of sexual activity between men. Most involved casual encounters. Some involved long-term relationships. The fact that this office found so many cases tells us the behavior was widespread despite its illegality. The church recognized that people, especially unmarried young people, would masturbate. Confessors were instructed to be relatively lenient, especially for adolescents. Following ancient physician Galen, medieval doctors believed that sexual release was necessary for health. Excess semen or sexual fluids building up in the body could cause illness. For women, especially widows or those whose husbands were absent, doctors sometimes prescribed manual stimulation to prevent the health problems believed to result from sexual deprivation. One medieval medical text describes a treatment for certain female ailments. The woman or a midwife should insert a finger covered with oil into the vagina and move it vigorously about until release occurred. This was framed as a medical procedure, not as sexual pleasure, which made it more acceptable. The tension between medical advice and religious teaching created confusion. Were you sinning if you masturbated for your health? Were you supposed to choose illness over sin? Different authorities gave different answers. Some priests were understanding, others strict. For married couples, the question of unnatural acts within marriage was debated. Could a married couple engage in oral or other non-procreative activities as foreplay before proceeding to proper intercourse? Some theologians grudgingly allowed this as long as the sexual encounter ultimately involved vaginal intercourse that could result in conception. Others condemned any non-procreative touching even between spouses. sex toys existed in the medieval world. Archaeological evidence and literary references confirm this. Wooden or stone phalluses, leather dildos. These were condemned, of course, but they existed because people used them. Women without male partners, or women whose husbands were impotent or absent, might use these objects. Lesbian sex was puzzling to many medieval male writers. How could two women have sex without a penis involved? Some assumed it could only happen if one woman used a dildo or similar object to penetrate the other. Without penetration, many male theorists couldn't conceive of it as real sex. This meant lesbian relationships were often invisible in records and less harshly punished than male homosexuality. If authorities discovered two women in a sexual relationship, the punishment was usually lighter than for two men, unless the women had used objects to simulate penetration, in which case it could be treated more seriously. The whole medieval system of sexual sin was based on a particular understanding of sex as penetration. The man was the active partner, the penetrator. The woman was the passive partner, the one penetrated. Any reversal of this, any situation where a man took the passive role or a woman the active role, threatened the gender hierarchy. This is why male homosexuality was so condemned. If a man submitted to being penetrated, he was taking a woman's role, debasing his masculine nature. The man who penetrated another man was seen as less culpable because he at least maintained the active, dominant role, even though the act itself was sinful. Female homosexuality was less threatening to the system because women were already considered inferior and passive. Two women together didn't upset the gender hierarchy as much as two men did. This doesn't mean it was accepted, but it was often treated as less serious. All of these categories and hierarchies reveal a medieval worldview that was deeply concerned with order, natural order, social order, gender order. Sex was supposed to reinforce these orders. Anything that disrupted them, that put people in the wrong roles, that confused the boundaries between human and animal, male and female, natural and unnatural, was condemned. But, as with everything else we've discussed, the gap between theory and practice was vast. People had sex in various positions. They engaged in oral, they used toys, they masturbated, they had same-sex encounters. Not everyone, not all the time, but enough that the authorities felt the need to write detailed rules and punishments. The medieval world was not the realm of missionary position-only monotony that stereotypes suggest. It was a world where people experimented, where desire led them in various directions, where the rules were clear, but compliance was inconsistent. When desire defied the marriage bed. The tradition of courtly love represents one of the most fascinating contradictions in medieval culture, a literary and social movement that celebrated passionate, devoted, often adulterous love in a society where adultery was a crime and the church condemned extramarital desire. Courtly love emerged in the 11th and 12th centuries in the courts of southern France, particularly Provence and Aquitaine. It was associated with the troubadours, poet-musicians who wrote sophisticated lyrics about love. These weren't simple love songs. They were complex, philosophical meditations on desire, longing, and devotion. The basic pattern of courtly love went like this. A knight or nobleman would become entranced by a lady, usually married, often of higher social status than himself. He would worship her from afar, declaring his devotion through poetry and song. He would perform deeds of valor in her name, hoping to win her favor. She might gradually acknowledge his devotion, granting him small tokens of favor. The relationship was supposed to ennoble both participants. What made courtly love distinctive was its emphasis on the lady's power and the man's submission. In regular medieval society, men dominated women legally, socially, economically. But in courtly love, the lady was sovereign. The knight subjected himself completely to her will. He would obey her slightest command. He would suffer for love of her. This reversal of normal power dynamics was part of the appeal. The question that has divided historians for decades is, was courtly love purely a literary game, or did people actually practice it? Did noble knights really have chaste but passionate relationships with married ladies, or was this just fantasy? The honest answer is, probably both. Courtly love was certainly a literary convention, an entertaining fiction explored in poetry and romance, but it also influenced real behaviour. Courts, especially those ruled by influential women like Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie de Champagne, really did have cultures that celebrated refined love and devotion. Whether these relationships remained chaste is another question. The troubadour poems and romance tales are ambiguous. Some clearly describe physical consummation. Others emphasize spiritual connection and deliberately frustrated desire. Andreas Capellanus, writing at the court of Marie de Champagne in the late 12th century, created a treatise on courtly love that includes explicit rules. Some of these rules: marriage is no excuse for not loving. A true lover is constantly obsessed with thoughts of the beloved. Love must be kept secret. The easy attainment of love makes it cheap. Difficulty makes it valuable. When one lover dies, the other must wait 2 years before taking a new love. Many scholars think Andreas was being satirical, that he was mocking courtly love rather than seriously prescribing it. But whether serious or satirical, the fact that he wrote it and people read it tells us these ideas were circulating. In reality, courtly love probably served as a cover for actual affairs. The language of courtly devotion gave noble men and women a way to conduct relationships that might or might not be consummated. If discovered, they could claim it was all innocent, just playing the courtly love game. But sometimes it wasn't innocent at all. The Church was deeply suspicious of courtly love literature because it glorified desire for someone other than your spouse. Even if the relationship remained physically chaste, the passionate longing was itself problematic. Jesus had said that looking at a woman with lust was committing adultery in your heart. Courtly love involved exactly this kind of passionate desire. Yet courtly love literature was enormously popular and influential. Chrétien de Troyes' romances about Lancelot and Guinevere, about Lancelot's devoted service to his king's wife. The story of Tristan and Isolde, lovers bound by a magic potion who betrayed King Mark. These tales were told and retold, copied and illuminated, beloved across medieval Europe. They influenced how people thought about love. The idea that passionate love was noble, that it could inspire great deeds, that it might exist outside or even in opposition to marriage, became part of the cultural landscape. This was a radical departure from earlier Christian teaching that passion was dangerous and marriage was about duty and procreation, not romance. For married nobles whose marriages were arranged for political or economic reasons, courtly love offered an alternative. You might have been married to consolidate lands or end a feud, but you could have a romantic relationship with someone else framed as courtly devotion. As long as you were relatively discreet and didn't create scandal, it might be tolerated. The double standard was still firmly in place, of course. A married man could have a courtly love relationship with some other woman, could write poetry to her, could be seen as romantic and refined. A married woman had to be much more careful. If her courtly love relationship crossed into physical adultery, she faced far more serious consequences than her male counterpart would. Some historical examples show this tension. Eleanor of Aquitaine was married to King Louis VII of France, then, after their marriage was annulled, to King Henry II of England. She was associated with promoting courtly love culture in her courts. Did she personally have affairs? Rumours circulated, but proof is lacking. What we know is that she supported poets who wrote about passionate love and created an atmosphere where such ideas could flourish. Her daughter Marie de Champagne commissioned Andreas Capellanus to write his treatise on love. Marie's court was famous for literary culture and refined manners. Some accounts claim she held courts of love, where noble ladies would hear cases and issue judgments about proper behaviour in romantic relationships. Most historians think these courts of love were fictional or at least highly exaggerated, but the stories reflect the association between Marie's court and the culture of courtly love. In practical terms, what did this mean for medieval sexuality? It meant that among the nobility, there was social space for romantic and possibly sexual relationships outside marriage, as long as they were conducted with sufficient refinement and discretion. The courtly love tradition legitimized desire and gave it a sophisticated vocabulary. For commoners, courtly love had less direct impact, though the ideas filtered down through popular literature. but the underlying tension between marriage as a social and economic arrangement and the desire for passionate love was universal. By the late medieval period, courtly love was already being satirized. The Romance of the Rose starts as a conventional courtly love allegory, but becomes increasingly cynical and misogynistic. Later medieval writers mocked the extravagant suffering and devotion of courtly lovers. The ideals were being questioned. Historical events also undermined it. The Tour de Nesle affair in 14th century France involved the daughters-in-law of King Philip IV being accused of adultery and subjected to brutal punishment. It demonstrated that while courtly love literature romanticized adultery, the real consequences for noble women caught in affairs could be devastating. Despite this, the influence of courtly love persisted. The idea that romantic love was valuable, that it could inspire nobility of character, that passionate devotion was admirable. These notions became embedded in Western culture. They influenced later ideas about love and marriage that we still see today. But in the medieval context, courtly love created a fascinating space where desire could be acknowledged and even celebrated, despite the Church's condemnation. It was another way medieval people navigated the gap between religious teaching and human emotion. Same-sex desire in a hostile world. Same-sex sexual relationships in medieval Europe existed in the shadows, subject to both religious condemnation and legal punishment, yet persistent nonetheless. Understanding medieval homosexuality requires recognizing how differently medieval people conceptualized sexuality compared to us. Modern categories like gay, lesbian, heterosexual didn't exist in the Middle Ages. Identity wasn't based on the gender of your sexual partners. What mattered was what role you took. Were you active or passive? Penetrating or being penetrated? This distinction was fundamental to how medieval people thought about sex. For men, the key question wasn't whether you had sex with other men. It was whether you took the passive, receptive role. A man who penetrated another man was engaging in sin, yes, but he at least maintained his masculine role. A man who submitted to being penetrated was considered far more transgressive because he was taking a woman's role, debasing his manhood. This created a complex situation. In many medieval contexts, especially in all-male environments like monasteries, universities, or military camps, sexual activity between men occurred with some frequency. As long as it remained discreet and as long as the men involved eventually married and had families, it might be overlooked. The sin was called sodomy, a term that encompassed various sexual acts including but not limited to male-male sex. Oral, anal sex, sex with animals, any non-procreative sexual act could fall under this category. The punishments for sodomy could be severe: burning at the stake, hanging, imprisonment. But actual prosecution varied widely. In some times and places, sodomy accusations were common and punishment harsh. In others, authorities rarely pursued cases unless they involved scandal, violence, or other aggravating factors. Social status mattered enormously. A nobleman accused of sodomy might face gentler consequences than a peasant. The office of the knight in Florence, which we mentioned earlier, provides fascinating evidence. Established in 1432 specifically to prosecute sodomy, this office investigated and prosecuted thousands of cases over the next 70 years. The records reveal a complex sexual culture. Many cases involved adult men having sex with adolescent boys or young men. This was often casual, sometimes involving payment, sometimes part of mentoring relationships. Other cases involved peers. Some men appeared in the records multiple times over years or decades. Some were also married to women. The point is that male-male sexual activity was widespread in Florence, despite being illegal and condemned. The penalties when prosecuted were usually fines, sometimes exile, rarely death, unless there were other aggravating circumstances. The authorities seemed more concerned with maintaining public order and preventing scandal than with eradicating same-sex activity. Lesbianism was even more hidden, both because women had less freedom and because male writers often couldn't conceive of how women could have sex without a penis involved. Many medieval texts on sexuality barely mention female-female sexual activity. When they do, it's often with puzzlement or the assumption that women must be using objects as substitutes for male genitalia. Some legal texts and theological discussions mention lesbian activity, usually in the context of condemning it as unnatural. If women used dildos or similar objects, this was treated more seriously because it involved the simulation of penetration. Without objects, lesbian sexual activity seemed to many male authorities almost incomprehensible. This meant lesbian relationships were often invisible in official records. Two women living together, sharing a bed, showing affection, this might not raise suspicions the way a similar relationship between two men would. Women were expected to have close friendships with other women. The line between intense friendship and romantic or sexual relationship could be blurry. There are hints of lesbian relationships in medieval sources. Poems from a 12th century manuscript show a woman writing passionate love poetry to another woman. Court cases occasionally mention women accused of sexual activity with other women. A woman in Bologna in 1295 was banished for having sex with women using a dildo-like device. But overall, medieval sources give us far less information about lesbian relationships than about male homosexuality. This doesn't mean they were less common. It means they were less documented, either because authorities didn't see them as seriously threatening, or because they simply didn't recognize them as sexual. For both men and women, the religious condemnation of same-sex activity was absolute. The Bible explicitly condemned men lying with men as an abomination. Medieval theologians interpreted this and other passages as forbidding all homosexual acts. They were sins against nature, perversions of God's created order. Same-sex desire was sometimes explained as the result of excessive lust. If someone was so consumed by sexual appetite that they would even turn to members of their own sex, they had fallen into terrible sin. Alternatively, it might be blamed on physical deformity or corrupting experiences in youth. The medical view was somewhat different. Following Galen and other ancient authorities, medieval medicine understood sexual desire as natural and necessary for health. But this was understood in terms of male-female coupling for procreation. Same-sex desire didn't fit the medical model well. Some medical texts suggested that imbalances in the humours could lead to deviant desires. A woman who was too hot and dry, taking on masculine qualities, might desire other women. A man who was too cold and moist, becoming effeminate, might desire other men. This medicalized same-sex desire as a form of illness or imbalance. The practical reality was that same-sex relationships and encounters happened throughout medieval society. In monasteries and convents, where men and women lived in same-sex communities, passionate friendships sometimes crossed into physical intimacy. We have accounts of monks being punished for sexual activity with each other. We have hints of romantic attachments between nuns. In universities, which were all-male institutions, students sometimes had sexual relationships with each other. The records of student discipline mention such cases. In military contexts, on crusades or campaigns, men separated from women for extended periods sometimes turned to each other. Among the nobility and educated classes, close same-sex friendships were celebrated. The line between passionate friendship and romantic or sexual relationship could be fluid. Men wrote to each other in language that seems very intimate to modern readers. Whether this intimacy was only emotional or also physical is often impossible to determine. Some historians have identified individuals in medieval records who seem to have had exclusively or primarily same-sex orientations throughout their lives. Others see medieval same-sex activity as more situational, driven by circumstances rather than orientation. The truth is probably both existed. What we can say with certainty is that the medieval world's hostility to same-sex activity didn't prevent it from occurring. People found ways to express same-sex desires despite the risks. Some were caught and punished, becoming cautionary examples. Others navigated their desires carefully, maintaining discretion and avoided consequences. The experience of people with same-sex desires in medieval Europe was shaped by silence, secrecy, and danger. There was no community in the modern sense, no social movement, no language to claim an identity. But there was desire, relationship, and intimacy, persisting in the gaps and shadows of a society that condemned it. Bodies, humours, and the medicine of sex. Medieval medicine had views on sex that often contradicted church teaching, creating another layer of complexity. While the Church said celibacy was holiest and sex was only for procreation, physicians said sexual activity was necessary for health. This medical understanding came primarily from ancient Greek medicine, especially the work of Galen in the 2nd century. Galen's theories dominated medieval medicine and included specific ideas about sexual health. The foundation was humoral theory. The body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health required these humours to be in balance. Illness resulted from imbalance. Sexual activity, according to this theory, helped maintain balance by allowing the body to expel excess fluids and heat. Men produced semen, which was considered a form of refined blood. If semen built up without being released, it could cause various problems: fever, headache, melancholy, even mental disturbance. Regular ejaculation was necessary to prevent these conditions. For women, the theory was similar. Women also produced sexual fluids that needed release. Medieval medicine believed women needed orgasm to conceive, because orgasm released the female seed that combined with male semen to create a child. Regular sexual activity and orgasm were therefore important for women's health, especially women of childbearing age. This created direct conflict with church teaching. If you were a married man whose wife was menstruating, pregnant, or in one of the many other states when the church forbade sex, but you were feeling feverish and unwell from retained semen, what should you do? Medical advice suggested you needed release for your health. Religious teaching said you must abstain. Some physicians explicitly recommended that men visit prostitutes for health reasons. If your wife was unavailable and your health was suffering, a controlled visit to a brothel was medically prudent, even if sinful. This medical justification for prostitution reinforced the social tolerance we discussed earlier. For celibate men like priests and monks, the medical theory created special problems. How were they supposed to maintain health without sexual release? Some physicians warned that prolonged celibacy was dangerous, potentially deadly. We have accounts of bishops and other church officials whose doctors urged them to break their vow of celibacy for their health. Thomas Becket's physician told him that celibacy was incompatible with his age and complexion. An unnamed 12th century bishop who tried to remain celibate became seriously ill when his genitals swelled after a month of abstinence. The church's solution was nocturnal emissions, wet dreams. These were considered involuntary and therefore not sinful, though they might require ritual purification. A celibate man could rely on nocturnal emissions to release excess semen without sinfully masturbating or having sex. But if nocturnal emissions weren't occurring frequently enough, medical theory suggested a man might actually need to masturbate for his health. Some physicians cautiously endorsed this. Church teaching condemned it. Men had to navigate between these competing authorities. For women, the situation was similar, but complicated by their subordinate position. A married woman whose husband was absent for a long period might suffer health problems from lack of sexual activity, according to medical theory. Physicians sometimes recommended treatments that involved stimulating the woman to orgasm. Medieval medical texts describe midwives or female healers treating women suffering from retention of sexual fluids by manually stimulating them. One text describes inserting an oiled finger into the vagina and moving it vigorously until the woman achieved release. This was framed as medical treatment, making it more acceptable. For widows or unmarried women past the age when they were likely to marry, the question of their sexual health was troubling. They weren't supposed to have sex, but they might need sexual release for their health.
Some physicians recommended they use their own fingers, others suggested that female friends or medical professionals could assist.
Medieval understanding of conception also shaped sexual practice. The belief that women needed to orgasm to conceive meant that husbands trying to have children were encouraged to ensure their wives' pleasure. Medical texts gave advice on how to arouse women, how to ensure their satisfaction, how to time intercourse for maximum fertility. This created a strange situation where sexual pleasure, otherwise condemned, was necessary for procreation, the only legitimate purpose of sex. A husband who wanted children needed to give his wife pleasure, but he shouldn't do it for the sake of pleasure itself, only for the sake of conception. Medieval medical texts also discussed what we would call sexual dysfunction. Impotence was a medical concern, both because it prevented conception and because inability to have sex was grounds for annulment. Physicians offered various treatments, special diets, herbal remedies, specific exercises, even mechanical devices. Some treatments were reasonable by modern standards, recommending rest, reducing stress, improving general health. Others were bizarre, applying various substances to the penis, consuming aphrodisiacs, using magical amulets. Female sexual dysfunction was also discussed. Women who couldn't conceive, who didn't desire sex, who couldn't achieve orgasm. These were considered medical problems requiring treatment. Remedies included herbal preparations, special foods, manipulation by midwives or physicians, prayers and pilgrimage. The medieval understanding of female anatomy was limited, but not completely ignorant. Physicians knew about the clitoris, understood it was sensitive and involved in sexual pleasure. Some medical texts describe it in detail. Others ignore it or confuse it with other structures. What medieval medicine generally missed was the connection between ovulation and menstruation. They understood that women were more fertile at some times than others, but they got the timing wrong. Some thought women were most fertile immediately after menstruation, which is actually when fertility is lowest. This misunderstanding affected both attempts to achieve pregnancy and attempts to avoid it. Medieval medicine also believed in the importance of simultaneous orgasm for conception. If both partners climaxed at the same time, the chances of conception were supposedly highest. This gave another medical reason to ensure the woman's pleasure. The medical view that sexual activity was healthy stood in tension with ascetic religious ideals. Monks and nuns who practiced extreme asceticism, including total sexual abstinence combined with fasting and physical mortification, were praised for their holiness. But physicians warned this was dangerous to health. Some medical writers tried to reconcile these views by distinguishing between different constitutions. Perhaps some people, specially chosen by God, could maintain celibacy without harm. But for ordinary people, sexual activity was necessary. This allowed both positions to be true depending on the individual. Medieval physicians also recognized sexually transmitted diseases, though they understood them differently than we do. Leprosy was sometimes believed to be transmitted through sex with prostitutes. Before syphilis arrived in Europe in the late 15th century, other diseases could be contracted sexually. The fear of disease was one reason men might be cautious about prostitutes, even as medical theory suggested visiting prostitutes for health. Some physicians recommended examining prostitutes for visible signs of disease, though their ability to identify infections was limited. Overall, medieval medicine created a framework where sexual activity was necessary, healthy, even mandatory for most people. This medical view coexisted uneasily with religious teaching that sex was sinful and celibacy ideal. The tension between these perspectives gave people justifications for sexual activity beyond procreation, while still maintaining the framework of sin and confession when religious authorities demanded it. Violence, vulnerability, and marital rights. We need to address violence in medieval Europe, because understanding medieval sexuality requires acknowledging that it wasn't all about desire and pleasure. It also involved coercion, assault, and the lack of legal protections that left many vulnerable. Medieval laws were complex and often inadequate to protect victims. However, the laws were heavily influenced by concerns about property and honor rather than bodily autonomy. A woman, particularly if she was unmarried, had lost something of value: her virginity, her reputation, her marriageability. The crime was often viewed more as theft from her father or guardian, or from her future husband, than as a violation of her person. This meant that prosecuting it was difficult. The woman's testimony alone was often insufficient. She needed witnesses, physical evidence, signs of resistance. If she couldn't prove she had fought back, if there weren't marks of violence, her accusation might be dismissed. Some legal systems required that she raise an immediate outcry, that she report the crime right away to be credible. For married women, the situation was even more complicated. Marriage gave the husband rights to his wife's body. She had consented to this when she married. There was a concept of the marital debt, the mutual obligation of spouses to provide sex to each other. Both husband and wife could demand sex from the other, and both were obliged to comply. This was one of the few areas where medieval law treated men and women equally, at least in theory. If a wife demanded sex, and the husband refused, he was failing in his marital duty just as much as if she refused him. But in practice, this meant a wife couldn't refuse her husband. He had the right to demand sex at any time, as long as it wasn't during one of the forbidden periods. Force, if necessary, was his right. A husband could be punished for excessive violence against his wife. If he beat her too severely, if he injured her badly, authorities might intervene. But the level of violence tolerated was shockingly high by modern standards. Some moderate beating of wives was considered acceptable, the husband's right to discipline. For unmarried women, it was theoretically a serious crime. Penalties could be severe: castration, blinding, execution. But, again, prosecution was rare and conviction rarer. The woman had to have impeccable reputation. Any hint that she was sexually active, that she had consented, that she had somehow invited the assault could destroy her case. Women who were prostitutes, servants, poor, or otherwise marginal had little legal recourse. Who would believe them? Who would care? The records show that many accused were acquitted, even when the evidence seemed strong, especially if they were of higher social status than their accuser. Sometimes it was part of a larger crime of abduction. A man might forcibly take a woman, carry her off, then claim they were married. If the woman became pregnant, or if her reputation was now ruined, her family might agree to the marriage rather than see her unmarried and dishonoured. The man would face reduced penalties or none at all if he married his victim. This created a perverse incentive. If a man wanted to marry a woman but her family refused or couldn't afford the dowry, he might abduct her, then offer marriage as a solution. This wasn't universally accepted, and some laws tried to prevent it, but it happened with enough frequency to show up regularly in court records. The church officially condemned all violence. It was a serious sin, but in practice the church's courts were often more concerned with consensual fornication. A woman might still be viewed as somehow tainted, especially if pregnancy resulted. Some sources suggest that pregnancy was sometimes taken as evidence of consent. The medical belief that women couldn't conceive without experiencing pleasure and orgasm led to the terrible logic that if a woman became pregnant, she must have felt pleasure and therefore must have consented on some level. This wasn't universal, but it appeared in some legal and medical discussions. For women religious, nuns and other women who had taken vows of chastity, it created a spiritual crisis. Had they lost their virginity? Were their vows violated? Church authorities generally held that it didn't violate virginity in a spiritual sense, since there was no consent. But the trauma and the social stigma remained. Violence also occurred within religious institutions. Priests who had spiritual authority over women sometimes abused that position. Women who came to confession were vulnerable to predatory priests who might coerce them into sexual acts, using the confessional as a private space for assault. The church tried to prevent this through rules about confession, but abuse occurred. Young people in positions of servitude, both male and female, were vulnerable to sexual exploitation by masters and mistresses. Servants could be coerced into sex, with the threat of being dismissed or beaten if they refused. If pregnancy resulted, the servant would typically be sent away in disgrace while the master faced little consequence. Children were also vulnerable. The age of consent was shockingly young by modern standards, 12 for girls, 14 for boys. Marriages could be consummated at these ages, which meant sexual activity with 12-year-olds was legal within marriage. Outside marriage, sex with children was condemned, but prosecutions were rare and the children often blamed for being seductive. There were some protections and some acknowledgement of violence as seriously wrong. Saints' lives sometimes featured women who were martyred for protecting their virginity. These stories presented women who fought off attackers as heroic, reinforcing that it was wrong and resistance was virtuous. Legal codes, despite their flaws, did recognize it as a crime. Some authorities took it seriously and did punish offenders, though inconsistently. The fact that penalties existed in law codes, even if enforcement was weak, shows some societal recognition that violence was wrong. But the overall picture is one where violence was common, prosecution rare, conviction rarer, and victims often blamed or dismissed. The legal and social structures didn't adequately protect bodily autonomy, especially for women who were poor, unmarried, or otherwise vulnerable. This darker aspect of medieval sexuality reminds us that while people in the past had desires and sought pleasure, they also lived in societies with power imbalances that enabled exploitation and abuse. The lack of modern concepts like consent, bodily autonomy, and women's rights meant that many people, especially women and children, experienced sexuality as something imposed upon them rather than freely chosen. The human element. As we near the end of this exploration, it's important to step back and recognize what all of this tells us about medieval people as human beings. They were not that different from us. They fell in love, they felt desire, they sought pleasure and intimacy, they navigated social expectations and personal wishes, they balanced religious teaching with practical reality. They made choices about their bodies and their relationships. The framework they operated within was different. The Church's authority was far greater. Women's legal rights were far more limited. The consequences of sexual choices could be more severe, especially for women. The lack of effective contraception meant sex carried the constant risk of pregnancy, but within that framework they were fully human. They were clever in finding ways around restrictions. They shared knowledge secretly. They supported each other. They created subcultures and communities where different behaviours were tolerated. Medieval society was not monolithic. There were differences by class, region, time period. What a peasant experienced was different from what a noble experienced. What happened in England was different from Italy. The 13th century was different from the 10th. But some patterns persist across these differences. The gap between official teaching and actual behaviour. The existence of contraception despite prohibition. The tolerance of prostitution despite condemnation. The continuation of premarital sex despite penalties. The persistence of same-sex relationships despite danger. These patterns tell us that human sexuality is powerful, adaptive, and resilient. It finds expression even in restrictive contexts. It generates innovation to navigate obstacles. It creates markets, communities, and knowledge networks to serve its needs. Medieval people created a rich sexual culture within their society's constraints. The poetry of courtly love, the regulations of municipal brothels, the herbal knowledge passed among women, the subtle negotiation of bedroom politics in arranged marriages. These were all expressions of human sexuality working within medieval circumstances. When we look back at medieval sexuality, we should resist two temptations. The first is to view medieval people as completely bound by religious teaching, sexually repressed and ignorant. The evidence shows this wasn't true. They knew about pleasure. They sought it. They found ways to have it. The second temptation is to project modern attitudes backward, to imagine that medieval people thought about sexuality the way we do. They didn't. The categories were different. The meanings were different. What we see as fundamental distinctions they might not have recognized. What they found important we might overlook. The truth is in the middle. Medieval people were human, with human desires and human ingenuity, but they were medieval humans shaped by their time and place, thinking in their categories, navigating their specific challenges. What we can appreciate is their humanity, the courage of people who loved despite prohibition, the resilience of people who found pleasure despite restriction, the creativity of people who developed knowledge and techniques despite suppression, the complexity of people who held multiple, sometimes contradictory, beliefs and behaviours. A medieval woman who attended Mass on Sunday, listened to the priest condemn fornication, then went home and prepared an herbal contraceptive for her daughter who was betrothed. A medieval man accepted penance, then did it again because his doctor said his health required it. A medieval couple who followed the Church's rules about avoiding sex during Lent, then made up for it enthusiastically when the restrictions lifted. These are the contradictions of real human life. Not hypocrisy exactly, but the complexity of living within systems that don't perfectly align with human needs and desires. Medieval people did what people have always done. They figured out how to navigate, how to find space for themselves, how to live with contradictions. Final reflections. We've journeyed through 1,000 years of European sexual history, from the Church's strict teachings to the reality of daily practice, from public bedding ceremonies to secret contraception, from legal prostitution to condemned sodomy. What emerges is a picture far more complex than the stereotypes suggest. The Middle Ages were neither a dark time of complete sexual repression nor a libertine free-for-all. They were a time when powerful institutions tried to control sexuality, and people navigated those controls with varying degrees of success and compliance. The medieval period shaped our modern attitudes in ways we often don't recognize. The idea that romantic love should be passionate and ennobling, that comes partly from courtly love. The association of virginity with virtue, especially for women, that's reinforced by medieval Christianity. The notion that some sexual acts are unnatural, that comes from medieval theological categories. But the medieval period also shows us that the gaps between rules and reality, between public morality and private behavior, have deep history. People have always found ways to express their sexuality despite restrictions. Knowledge about contraception and child termination has been passed down for centuries. Same-sex desire has persisted despite condemnation. Understanding medieval sexuality helps us understand our own moment. The debates we have today about sexual morality, about the proper role of law and religion in regulating sex, about women's autonomy and same-sex relationships, these all have medieval precedents. The specific positions have changed, but the underlying tensions remain. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this exploration of medieval history and want more content like this, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me create more deep dives into historical topics. Let me know in the comments what surprised you most about medieval sexuality. What confirmed stereotypes you had, and what challenged them? Are there specific aspects you'd like me to explore in more detail in future videos? Medieval people were our ancestors, not just biologically, but culturally. The society they built, with all its contradictions and complexities, shaped the world we inherited. Understanding their sexuality helps us understand them as fully human, not just as figures in stained glass windows or illuminated manuscripts, but as people who loved and desired, who struggled and adapted, who created lives within their circumstances. As you drift off to sleep or continue with your day, carry with you this image. Medieval Europe was a place where the sacred and profane coexisted, where rules were strict but often broken, where human sexuality found expression despite all attempts to contain it. It was messy, complicated, often unjust, but deeply recognizably human. Sweet dreams or good morning, wherever in the world you are. Until next time.